right, welcome everyone. I think we'll get started as others trickle in. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. We're really pleased to welcome you to the third event of our conversation series in Canadian Bioethics. This is hosted by the Canadian Bioethics Society, la Société canadienne de bioéthique, and is generously supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We have a few ways that you can join our conversation today. We are very pleased to have live simultaneous interpretation available for the session in both English and in French. We have some content in French and in English today. So if you would like to listen only in one language, please use the interpretation button in your Zoom and select which language you would like to be listening to the presentation in. We will be holding a discussion period at the end of the presentation. However, you can enter a question at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And you have the option of submitting questions anonymously or having your name associated with it. And if you'd prefer not to have your name mentioned in association with the questions, it's probably best to submit the question anonymously. We also encourage you to share your thoughts about future sessions and on this session through our evaluation, which we'll be sending the link out possibly now and definitely at the end of the presentation. So we really do look forward to hearing any feedback that you can offer us so we can make this more useful for you. Also, just to let you know, this is being recorded and we will be posting the recording on the CBS-SCB website after the presentation. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homelands and Métis nations of Alberta Region 4. I really encourage all of you just to take a moment to think about the land that you're on and the Indigenous peoples, including the Métis, the Inuit, and other ancestors who have lived and honored this land for centuries. And by taking these moments, I think this is an opportunity for all of us to reflect and ponder and to recommit to addressing the injustices and the past and also the systemic racism and oppression that continue against the Indigenous First Peoples in what we now call North America. Just a little bit about the Canadian Bioethics Society before we get going. We are a national forum to discuss bioethics issues in Canada, and anyone who's interested in bioethics is welcome to join. Our conversation in Canadian Bioethics series was launched this spring as a means to offer some engagement and participation among our CBS members and others, especially in light of us not having conferences at this point. We do have one other episode coming up for us in November on bioethics and racism, and this actually will be coinciding with National Health Ethics Week, November 7th to 11th. So we encourage you both to come to that event and also to think about other ways in which you can participate in National Health Ethics Week or host an event, and there's more information about that on our website. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention that we will be hosting a workshop and community forum online in May of next year. This is a forum for us, as it says in the title, to come together to do some workshops and some engagement and kind of reconnect in other sorts of ways. And our call for abstracts for workshop proposals is open now. So we really do encourage you to consider submitting a proposal or an abstract for this event. And again, any additional information on CBS, any of these events or anything else is available on our website. One of the real benefits of the conversation series is that it's provided us to highlight our supporting organizations and thank them for their ongoing support. And the supporting organization that we're highlighting in this session is the École de Santé Publique de l'Université de Montréal. And we'd like to share a video that Charles Duprat has made telling us a little bit more about that.
I'm happy to be joining you today. The interpreter's sorry, there's no sound. The interpreter's sorry, there's no sound coming through from the students in 5 areas: prevention,
bioethics as we understand it is this truly interdisciplinary field of study and practice, which aims to better understand and, where possible, to prevent and find solutions to ethical issues related to the development of science and technology and their application to human health and to other sectors. Bioethics for us is this vast, open to change and constantly evolving field which brings together people interested in clinical ethics, research ethics, health policy and public health ethics, but also animal ethics and environmental ethics. Nos programmes de formation regroupent des professeurs réguliers avec des intérêts de recherche diversifiés, des professeurs adjoints de clinique, des professeurs associés, des chargés de cours d'expérience. Toutes les personnes qui sont passionnées par la bioéthique et qui se penchent sur des questions éthiques liées par exemple.
The interpreter, sorry, but the sound is really not good enough. This video sound is not good enough.
À l'allocation des ressources humaines en santé, à la conduite responsable de la recherche, aux technologies de pointe en génétique, intelligence artificielle, en neurosciences, à la gestion des bases de données, à la protection de la vie privée, aux mesures aux interventions de santé publique, au changement climatique ou encore en lien avec la promotion de l'équité, de la diversité ou de l'inclusion au sein de nos institutions scientifiques et établissements de santé. Au programme de bioéthique, on a aussi la chance d'avoir le support de partenaires exceptionnels parmi les employeurs potentiels de nos étudiants, des partenaires qui agissent souvent d'ailleurs comme des maîtres de stage, dans les comités d'éthique de la recherche, dans les hôpitaux et centres hospitaliers universitaires, dans les CIS, les CHSLD, dans les centres de recherche, dans les comités d'agences gouvernementales. Ces interactions avec des personnes pratiquant la bioéthique à l'extérieur des murs de l'université sont d'une grande valeur pour nous et pour les étudiants de nos programmes. Ils peuvent se former dans des contextes où les problématiques éthiques sont bien réelles et où il y a un besoin concret de trouver des solutions qui fonctionnent. Another of the great aspects of our programs is the diversity of the students who join us and who make our programs so dynamic and productive. We are fortunate to welcome a mix of people who have training in law, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, nurses, physicians, psychologists, people who also train in biology and other natural sciences, who come to work with us, some because they've experienced concrete ethical issues in their respective workplaces, others who are concerned about the development of science and technology and who want to reflect with us on the impact of these technologies on their loved ones and on society in general. Our bioethics programs train researchers, some who will have academic careers, but also other healthcare professionals, healthcare administrators, and public policy analysts who come to learn with us about ethics and then return to their workplaces with the tools to find practical solutions to complex ethical dilemmas and problems. Pour répondre aux besoins et aux ambitions variées de nos étudiants, plusieurs cheminements sont offerts dans nos programmes. Au deuxième cycle, on a un micro-programme et un DESS, un diplôme d'enseignement supérieur spécialisé, qui peuvent être tous les deux suivis à temps plein ou à temps partiel pour les personnes qui combinent, par exemple, les études avec d'autres responsabilités professionnelles ou familiales. On a la maîtrise professionnelle, qui inclut des stages d'observation active de la bioéthique dans différentes organisations. Et la maîtrise de recherche, plus traditionnelle avec mémoire, qui est le chemin le plus souvent emprunté par les personnes visant une formation de troisième cycle par la suite. On est d'ailleurs particulièrement fiers de pouvoir offrir à l'École de santé publique un programme complet de troisième cycle en bioéthique, le premier programme de doctorat au Canada spécifiquement en bioéthique. Chaque année, on admet en moyenne 25 à 30 étudiants au deuxième cycle et 3 à 5 étudiants au doctorat. On offre aussi depuis quelques années une mineure de premier cycle en bioéthique pour les étudiants qui désirent faire un baccalauréat par cumul de disciplines. L'autre nouveauté, on a récemment développé un partenariat avec des collègues de l'Université de Nantes en France dans le cadre d'un projet de maîtrise internationale en bioéthique qui vient réaffirmer le rôle de premier plan de notre université dans le développement et la promotion du champ de la bioéthique dans le monde de la francophonie. One of the great stories of our bioethics programs in recent years has been the success of the Canadian Journal of Bioethics, a bilingual, open access, no publication charge journal that was found 10 years ago through the leadership of our student association. The Canadian Journal of Bioethics is now supported by SSHRC's aid to scholarly journals and publishes high-quality material in a variety of formats, including peer-reviewed articles, commentaries, letters to the editor, book reviews, and other innovative formats. Our academic community is frequently engaged in the public sphere, where it contributes to encouraging open debates on the major ethical issues of our time. This place that bioethicists are taking or should take in the public sphere, and how, is the subject of the event that brings us together today, and that will undoubtedly call upon our reflexivity. I would like to congratulate the Canadian Bioethics Society for addressing this important theme, and conclude by warmly thanking them for offering us this great opportunity to showcase our bioethics programs. Je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous une très enrichissante et stimulante conversation sur la bioéthique canadienne.
All right, thank you so much, Cheryl. That was really helpful and interesting to learn about your program. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce the moderator and the speaker for our session today on bioethics and activism. Our moderator, Christy Simpson, is an associate professor and now previous head of the Department of Bioethics in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University. She's the department's coordinator of the Ethics Collaborations Team, which provides ethics supports for Nova Scotia Health, IWK, and the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network. Her primary responsibilities in this role include ethics education and capacity building, policy development and review, and support for clinical and organizational ethics consultations. And Christy has served previously as the Canadian Bioethics Society president and as the chair of the Canadian Association for Practicing Healthcare Ethicists. Our speaker, Dr. Joseph Stramondo, is an associate professor of philosophy and director of the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs at San Diego State University. In addition, for the 22-23 academic year, Dr. Stramondo will hold the Hubert Mader Visiting Professorship in Bioethics and the Albert Nagy Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University. His research focuses on the intersection of biomedical ethics and philosophy of disability. Namely, he is concerned with how bioethics can be reframed by centering on the lived experience of disability as a crucial source of moral knowledge that should guide clinical practice, biomedical research, and health policy. He has published scholarship on topics ranging from informed consent procedures to reproductive ethics to pandemic triage protocols to assistive neurotechnology, and his work appears in or is forthcoming in venues such as the Hastings Center Report, Ethical Theory and Moral Practice, and several other well-regarded journals for sure. He is also working on a book manuscript that is tentatively entitled The Ethics of Choosing Disability. So with that, I hand this over to you, Christy, and I look forward to the presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Catherine. And I'll extend also a very warm welcome to first our speaker that will be coming up in just a moment, Dr. Joe Stramondo, and he's encouraged us to call him Joe, so you'll see me doing that during the session as well. But also a very warm welcome to all of you that have joined this conversation series. If this is your first one, welcome to this. If you've attended the other sessions that have been occurring with CBS, I'm glad you're back. And hopefully you'll continue to join the CBS conversations that are upcoming as well. I think for me, I've been looking forward to this session since I was invited to be the moderator, because I think the title is provocative and evocative. It's a title that says bioethics and bioethicists and activism. What does that mean? And I think one of my first questions was, why activism, not advocacy? Is there a distinction? How do those terms fit together or not? And with that, and as I'll come back to say after Joe's shared his thoughts, some of that locates me within the Canadian bioethics community as well, in terms of some of the historical conversations that we've had around the nature and intersections of bioethics as a field and activism and advocacy, and in particular roles that each of us may inhabit in the field of bioethics itself. So with that, I definitely am looking forward to what Joe will be sharing with us today. His slides that he has are titled How Disability Activism Advances Disability Bioethics. And he also has a recent article. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll encourage you to take a look at his article too. And I think as you consider and reflect on what Joe shares with us, I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions about his particular arguments and how he puts the activism and bioethics together and sort of where he's fitting those pieces. And I think that'll be wonderful to sort of have that conversation together. But also, we can have a conversation too about bioethics and bioethicists and activism writ large too. So I encourage you to also think, while we're focusing first on disability bioethics and disability activism, how does that also apply outside of those areas or intersect with other areas, maybe is even a better way to put it? What does that encourage us to think about wherever we might be coming from in terms of today's conversation? So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Joe, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction. To follow suit, I want to just acknowledge that I am coming to you from San Diego, which is occupied Kumeyaay territory. I am so excited to be able to talk about my work specifically around bioethics and activism today. As was mentioned, this presentation grows out of a paper that was recently appeared in the journal Ethical Theory and Moral Practice. And so if you want sort of a more detailed argument than what I can offer orally, then I would encourage you to go and check out the full paper, because here I don't have time to go through every single philosophical move and counter move. So I'm going to start off by talking about the tension between scholarly bioethics and activism. There was a special issue of the flagship journal Bioethics that came out a couple of years ago, talking about the subject of whether or not bioethicists ought to be activists. And I kind of instead decided that was an interesting question, but also it was interesting to think about folks who are not bioethicists and aren't sort of trained formally in the field, contributing to it nevertheless, how they might, in a sense, advance bioethics as a scholarly practice. And so I sort of reversed the question in my analysis. So nevertheless, I want to start with some of the discussion of this tension between activism and bioethics. One of the folks that I admire within the field of bioethics, Tom Shakespeare, seems to think that bioethics and activism is in tension in such a way that they are incompatible because of their methodologies. And so he borrows from a moral psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who says, looks at the rational and the intuitive and distinguishes between the two ways in which people think. Just to read the block quote here. He describes the judge who explores all of the evidence and weighs it up carefully before coming to her opinion. The second style of thinking is the barrister, who knows the position he wants to adopt in advance and then selects the evidence to support his intuitions. And so the argument is that most people think like barristers, whereas bioethicists, or just scholars in general, ought to think like a judge and be sort of more objective in weighing evidence. And as he says, if new evidence or argument comes to light, which is irreconcilable with my current position, but nonetheless robust, then I have to change my position. So for Shakespeare, he thinks that there is this sort of objective standpoint of rationality, that one can view a controversial bioethical question from, weigh evidence, and then make a judgment, as opposed to the activist, who he argues is more like a barrister, who starts with the conclusion and then sort of cherry picks evidence to support it. This is not an altogether unfamiliar way of thinking about what academics and scholars do. In fact, we can see this view about objectivity and reason and rationality for thousands of years, right? Looking all the way back to the ancient Greek tradition of philosophical methodology. And so to think about this in light of the tension between Bioethics and Activism, we can look at Peter Singer, who's, of course, one of the most famous and well-known bioethicists, who's been talking about activism almost in terms of an existential threat to bioethics for like 30 years. So as far back as 1992, I was 10 years old at the time, and I'm not a young man. Peter Singer said, taken together, they amount to a concerted attack, not just on a particular ethical position, but on the very possibility of pursuing applied ethics as a free and critical inquiry. And he was talking about disability activists specifically in this paper that appeared in the Journal of Applied Philosophy. Then as recently as just last year, he sort of repeated this kind of view where he was describing his new journal that he had founded, the Journal of Controversial Ideas. He founded this journal sort of in response to this existential threat of activism, okay? He wanted to provide space, supposedly to publish controversial ideas that couldn't be silenced by activists who he sees as using a incompatible methodology, I believe, sort of like Shakespeare has advanced the idea. So I want to challenge this idea that there is somehow an incompatibility in style or in methodology at the core of activism versus scholarship, or bioethics in this case, but I think scholarly activity in general. I want to argue that even when disability activists are most clearly acting as activists, and we can discuss in Q&A exactly what I mean by activism versus advocacy, but to use sort of the quintessential or paradigmatic activity of activism, I want to talk about nonviolent direct action or civil disobedience. And so I want to argue that even when disability activists, or any activist really, I think this can extrapolate to other situations, are clearly not being judges, right? Are not sort of coming from this objective, neutral standpoint, but in fact, trying to change power dynamics with things like nonviolence, that they still are adding something crucial to the activity of bioethics and to scholarship, and ought not to be seen as in tension with or somehow adversarial to scholarly bioethics, but rather adding to scholarly bioethics. And so the reason why I think that's the case, I'm sort of have the summary slide here. The reason why I think that's the case is because I just don't buy the idea that there is such a thing as a judge, as a rational, objective standpoint that a human being can occupy that can sort of impartially weigh evidence. I think that we all have a socially situated embodiment that is our standpoint, and that is sort of the location of our epistemology and our knowledge. And so if there's no such thing as reasoning as a judge, because in some sense we are all barristers with different amounts of power and different embodiments, then we can't sort of regard ourselves as judges just because we happen to have more power within sort of the social scheme. Okay, now none of this is new, right? You have somebody like Charles Mills making a similar argument. Some folks might be familiar with his famous paper. I think it's called Ideal Theory as Ideology in Hypatia, like 20 years ago, where he was making this kind of argument against impartiality, or the myth of impartiality, right? We have work about epistemic injustice by Miranda Fricker. We have all of the work from feminist standpoint epistemology. Even the ethics of care is within this framework of trying to challenge this notion that folks like Shakespeare and Singer are still clinging to, that there is this Archimedean point of objectivity and knowledge, okay? So one thing that I think is crucial in our particular development of our particular point of view that each of us has is the narratives that we have adopted or not adopted about who certain people are and what we can expect from them, okay? Because these narratives that are adopted or rejected based on power dynamics play a role in determining which kinds of arguments we find sort of intuitively appealing, intuitively acceptable or not, okay? And we talk about our intuitions, right? In scare quotes, as if we all have the same intuitions, which is exactly what I'm trying to point out is false, okay? And so I want to suggest that disability activism can shift power dynamics and provide sort of alternative narratives that can give us a fuller picture of who people are and what we can expect from them, and can challenge sort of some of these very deep-seated core intuitions that folks have that are largely unexamined and that seem to act as unexamined premises to the supposedly objective arguments that are offered in mainstream scholarly bioethics. So that's sort of the shape of what I'm going to be arguing for today. Rather than trying to go through all of the different arguments from Fricker and the feminist standpoint theorists and Charles Mills, I want to home in on one particular theoretical intervention that I have found useful from Jackie Leach Scully in her 2008 book, Disability Bioethics, where she makes this argument that every human being is situated in what she calls a habitus, which is a pattern of being and doing in the world that people acquire through becoming habituated to a particular social field, which generates its own system of tacit rules governing practices and behavior. And so she argues that our habitus, our intuitions about right and wrong, what we find to be intuitively barbaric or intuitively good, is something that is developed through our socially mediated and embodied psychological and moral development, okay? It's developed in the social context of one's particular embodiment and isn't itself really subject to deliberative process, right? Maybe we can change people's habitus or challenge people's habitus, but it's not something that you can change with reasons and with rationality, because it exists sort of separate from these processes of reason and rationality, okay? And so that's the starting point here. And what I want to suggest is that disability bioethics is at its core, in order for it to gain uptake, folks with a different habitus have to be able to come into conversation with folks that have this sort of dominant mainstream habitus. In other words, folks that are disabled, that have this alternative embodiment, that have developed different intuitions because of how they interact with the world and their social situation and their embodiment, they need to somehow come into conversation with folks that have this non-disabled habitus, right? That have patterns of being and doing that are the background conditions of the rationality and of their sort of reasoned argumentation that provide very different intuitions, right? Or very different background conditions for finding something that is or is not out of alignment with what is obviously absurd or illogical or barbaric, as Scully says, okay? And so Scully's upshot is that someone's embodiment influences their experience of the world to such the degree that it shapes their moral intuitions, and that this is true of everyone, disabled and non-disabled alike. However, there are some folks with more power, and therefore some folks that have the kinds of embodiments that become dominant, and therefore the intuitions that become dominant, okay? And so we're all barristers in this sense of working from our intuitions, but some of us can sort of hold ourselves up as if we were judges, in as far as our intuitions align with this dominant habitus, okay? And so this is not really a matter of rationality, but it's a matter of power, okay? So there can be this mismatch that can arise between the sorts of reasons that people take to be compelling when they are embodied in the sort of dominant way, and therefore have these dominant ways of thinking, these dominant intuitions, and those that are embodied in different sort of atypical ways, and that have sort of therefore anomalous ways of thinking about morality, or as Scully puts it, anomalous embodiment generates at least some moral dispositions that fit awkwardly to the schemes of evaluation driven by the dominant habitus. Now, this isn't, again, new. Here she's talking about disability when she's talking about anomalous embodiment, right? But the fact of the matter is that this works, I think, for all kinds of embodiments that aren't sort of the socially and politically dominant ones, right? This works for non-white embodiments. This works for queer embodiments. This works for women and their embodiment. That was sort of the great contribution of the ethics of care historically in philosophy, where we have this idea that your social position can, in some sense, determine your intuitions, which then can fit awkwardly in sort of the dominant moral scheme. And so we have this little cartoon here of a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, which I think is one way of illustrating this idea. So I want to pivot away from Scully for a minute to give folks some hope, right? Just because people with different embodiments develop different intuitions that are prediscursive and that aren't the subject or aren't subject to reasoned debate, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that we can't talk to each other, right? It doesn't mean that we can't find sort of some kind of common ground to hash it out, right? When we disagree about things, okay? What I want to suggest is that in order to find that common ground, it needs to be created. It can't just sort of be presumed, okay? And so in order to create that common ground, we need activism, okay? We need activism to challenge the dominant common moral intuitions of those with the dominant typical habitus, okay? And the way I think activism can challenge the dominant habitus, right, is through narrative ethics, okay? So my mentor, Hilda Lindemann, at the time of her publication in 2001, she was using Lindemann Nelson, and so that's why you might see sort of some citations of Nelson and then me talking about Lindemann. It's kind of confusing, but it is what it is. She came up with a narrative ethics that I think can be useful to us when thinking about how to change the dominant intuitions so that they can come into conversation more easily with folks in sort of non-dominant social positions, okay? She appeals to this idea of master narratives. Now, master narratives, she says, are stories that are found lying about in our culture that serve as summaries of socially shared understandings, consisting of stock plots that are readily recognizable character types. Okay, and so these master narratives aren't all bad. In fact, they are essential for us being able to function in the world, for us to sort of understand who we are and who others are and how to interact with other human beings, okay? They help us understand the world and our place in it by decreasing cognitive load when we make inferences about others and what we can expect from them. And they also provide sort of raw materials for us to be able to tell others about ourselves and who we are in a way that others can understand and that's sort of intelligible, okay? And so to give a couple of quick examples of how master narratives can sort of serve this important function, you might see a cishet white man pull up to a daycare in a shiny black SUV wearing a suit jacket in the late afternoon. And so our master narratives about who people are and what we can expect tell us through this simple observation that he's there to collect his kid from the daycare, not to start working as the part of the evening cleaning crew, okay? And so we can sort of make inferences about who others are and what to expect with these master narratives. We can also appeal to these master narratives when telling others about who we are, right? So I might tell you that I'm a father or a collegiate sports fan or a philosopher or a disabled person as a way of constructing myself through these master narratives in a way that you can understand, okay? However, these master narratives can also be problematic in certain ways that are troubling, because while they help structure the social field of the dominant habitus, they can exert influence over which beliefs people find compelling or not, which beliefs are intuitively acceptable or not, based on these dominant master narratives that we adopt, okay? And so when an argument from somebody with a non-dominant embodiment rests on premises that don't cohere with these dominant master narratives, it's more easily dismissed as absurd, okay? And so in the US, there's been a lot of political upheaval lately about police violence. And police violence, there is this sort of master narrative around who the police are and when they are justified by using violence. And a lot of times, policing and violence is justified and sort of seen as praiseworthy because cops are the good guys, right? This is the shared story that most folks have in the dominant position about who cops are, right? Children play cops and robbers, and it's always the cops that are the good guys, right? Or when they're portrayed on TV or in film, we see police officers as good people that are protecting others and that are doing rights and doing just praiseworthy things, okay? And so when Black Lives Matter activists come and want to sort of challenge that script, then white folks very easily dismiss this kind of argument and say, well, you should have complied, or a police officer has a right to self-defense, and so on and so forth, because their intuitions are shaped by this dominant story of who police officers are and what they do. So I want to suggest that something similar is going on with disability and the master narratives of disability that we find within mainstream bioethics, okay? And so there's lots of master narratives about disability. It's not just sort of a singular master narrative about who disabled people are and what they do and so on and so forth. But one I think that's particularly common and that's particularly troubling to bioethics is what we might call the master narrative of the pitiful disabled person, which is ancient. Okay, this is the idea that disability is fundamentally and inevitably an experience of suffering. And so disabled people, as a response, deserve our pity. Okay, and so we have, ancient Greek gods like Hephaestus, who's, of course, clever, right? But nobody would want to be Hephaestus because he's disabled and he's ugly. And he has this wife, Aphrodite, who's beautiful and is constantly cheating on him, and we feel bad for Hephaestus, and we see that he's a little bitter about it, and we can sort of pity this situation that's this poor cripple that has this situation on his hands, right? Likewise, we have the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right, who is inevitably tragic, whether he's portrayed by the classic work of Victor Hugo, or if he's portrayed by Disney's animation studio, right? He is a tragic hero and someone that we have pity on for his situation, right? Now we can take this step further and talk about the master narrative of the pitiful disabled person who's better off dead, right? And so you can see how some of these master narratives fit in with various critiques from disability bioethics of the arguments that are dominant within mainstream scholarly bioethics, right? And so this master narrative basically says that disability is fundamentally an experience of suffering that's so severe that at least some disabled people are so pitiful that they would be better off dead, right? And we see this in Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men with Lenny, who is euthanized by his pal George, because at least in part because he doesn't fit in with the rest of society because of his intellectual disability. Okay. Likewise, spinal cord injury is the big one recently in popular film. We have $1 Million Baby, we have Gattaca, we have Me Before You, all of which portray spinal cord injury as a fate worse than death. And that we are, compelled to find the protagonist of these films pitiful and therefore sympathize with a desire to die. I want to suggest that this goes beyond arguments like medical aid in dying. This goes into virtually all features of bioethical analysis, right? If we're talking about something like CRISPR and how we ought to be able to use CRISPR and what kinds of uses are justified or not, right? A lot of people will say, well, of course we ought to avoid the creation of disabled people with something like CRISPR, even if it's scary to use CRISPR in other cases, right? In the US, we recently have Roe v. Wade overturned, right? And so we see lots of situations in which people want to carve out exceptions for disability and are, adamantly sort of pro-life, right? And want to protect the fetus and so on and so forth. Yet when we talk about disability, the tune changes because disability is tragic and pitiful and so on, right? And so we ought not to sort of think that the implications of what I'm talking about here are limited to one bioethical concern. So the move here that connects, I think, these master narratives to bioethics is how bioethics has sort of adopted pity as a virtue in some sense, right? Now, this isn't explicit, right? You don't see pity invoked as sort of one of the principles from Beauchamp and Childress, right? But that's not how master narratives work. That's not how habitus works, ever, right? They're never explicit premises in moral reasoning. They operate as part of the background conditions that determine what kinds of reasons are taken to be reasonable and that are intuitively appealing. And so they're pre-discursive. And so if master narratives are some of these basic building blocks of meaning that tell us who people are and what we can expect from them, right? Then claims that run counter to them are rendered almost meaningless. And so when you have somebody like Rosemary Garland Thompson, who wrote this wonderful paper in, I can't remember the name of the journal, but it's called The Case for Conserving Disability. And it argues that we ought to understand disability as a social natural resource and something that we ought not to seek to eliminate with various technologies or practices, because if we do, then we lose something crucial and important within the world, okay? And that's, I think, something that is taken as a sort of widely, obviously absurd by most people, because they haven't challenged this background assumption that disability is something that is pitiful and sometimes even a fate worse than death. So why would we want to use biotech to create more Quasimodos, so to speak, right? Lindemann offers us a way to get at and, in fact, challenge these master narratives, okay? But her methodology for doing that is not via reasonable, rational debate. It's not by going to conferences and publishing papers and so on and so forth. So that's bad news for me, right? But it's good news nevertheless, because there is this way of getting onto the same playing field and having conversations that can be aligned with similar intuitions, right? Lindemann says that what we need are counter stories that root out the master narratives and the tissue stories that constitute an oppressive identity and replace that with stories that depict the person as morally worthy, okay? And so when Lindemann writes about counter stories, she doesn't talk about activism, right? And most people, when they think about counter stories, don't think about activism, right? They think about other ways of offering alternative stories about who people are and what they're like, okay? Memoir is a big one. That's one that Jackie Leach Scully uses in her book to talk about ways of finding common ground, right? Folks are interested in memoir. There's so many good ones. There's some of the more recent memoirs that have come out from the disability community include Golem Girl by Riva Lair. Another one that's gotten a lot of buzz is by, Judy Heumann is the author. She has an accompanying Netflix documentary. Her book is called Being Human, and it serves this purpose of offering a counter story, I think. And most recently, we have The Year of the Tiger by Alice Wong. Now, these are all Americans. I'm biased. That's sort of what I know best. I'm sure there are Canadians that also have memoir out that do some of this work of counter storytelling, okay? I want to suggest that disability activism and activism in general can also be a mode of counter storytelling, okay? I want to suggest that counter stories provide an alternative narrative of who an oppressed group is and what they're like in a way that directly confronts power dynamics to gain uptake, okay? And so we can look at an example. We see in the United States anyway, this history of nonviolent direct action in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, with the lunch counter sit-ins and the marches and the civil disobedience and so on, gave the lie to the brutal, unjust policies of Jim Crow, right? He showed that having segregated lunch counters was unjust by violating the law of segregation of lunch counters, right? And forcing people to be dragged away and abused in various ways as they were just trying to get lunch served to them, right? And so part of the work of the nonviolent direct action had to do with the narratives around the laws themselves and the unjust policies themselves, right? But I want to suggest that what King was doing during the 1960s was also narrative work around Black identity, around the construction of who Black people are and what you can expect from them that allegedly justified white supremacist policies, okay? Work that is sort of not able to be done with reasoned argumentation. That has to happen at a different intuitive level, okay? So as Black folks took abuse at lunch counters and in the streets, activists were seen as thoughtful, calm, determined, everything contrary to the racist portrayals of centuries of racist, white supremacist master narratives around who Black folks are. And so nonviolent direct action that King was doing was not only getting at the concrete policies of segregation, but also for a time, forcing the world to notice how wrong white supremacy not only is about the policy, but is about who Black people are and what they're like, okay? So in conclusion to my talk today, really, I want to say that this is the work that disability activists are doing, okay? That can affect bioethics, but can affect the world at large, right? Disability activists, when they are at their most disruptive even, can challenge power relations and identity distorting master narratives about disabled people. And one in particular is this master narrative of the pitiful disabled person better off dead, right? So here's a photo of a bunch of power wheelchair users blocking an intersection on a street. I think it's in Seattle. And so the example here is that blocking a thoroughfare like Independence Avenue or wherever with power wheelchairs challenges the view that disabled people are pitiful, right? By forcing at least some of the general public, perhaps, to recognize that there's this gap between the identity distorting master narrative of pity and the lived experience of disability, right? So it's very difficult to pity someone who's deliberately using their 300-pound power wheelchair to block your commute, okay? You might admire them, maybe. You might just really be annoyed with them, right? You might have anxiety around not, making your appointments. You might have anger toward them, right? But you're not going to pity them, right? You're almost certainly not going to pity them. And so, in a sense, the activists here are not wheelchair bound. The commuter is wheelchair bound, right? And so the idea here is that you get at these deep-seated intuitions about who disabled people are, what you can expect from them through activism of various stripes that challenge that non-disabled habitus, okay? And the kinds of arguments that feel sort of intuitively appealing to the mainstream, okay? And so it's by that work that disability activism, by challenging oppressive master narratives, has this sort of epistemic function as they reconstruct identities for disabled people, so that when the disability bioethics scholarship comes into play, the habitus of bioethics is more likely to give careful consideration to those arguments, right? It's, claims and arguments that run contrary to oppressive master narratives that describe how disabled people just are, right? Will, not be as easily dismissed as wishful thinking, okay? And so that's most of what I have today. There's more on the slides, there's much more in the paper, but I think that I want to leave some time for discussion, so I'm gonna stop talking now.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah, I really appreciate how you've gone through all of these different facets to bring together, as you said, that flipped question, right? The flip of looking at what are activists and challenging, encouraging, fostering in terms of bioethics work rather than the other way around. And I guess just as folks are thinking about their questions for Joe, and I encourage you to type them into the question and answer box, and we'll get to those. I think for me, as I sort of said, I was locating myself within the Canadian bioethics community. And I think what I'm going to do in a few comments is actually collapse that distinction again, right? And bring together that question of activism and bioethics together, particularly because you bring up that question of common ground, right? Or finding common ground. And I think in some ways, a number of bioethicists, if I would say the practicing healthcare ethicists of us, those that work in hospitals or are aiming our written work towards that, often think about how do we create a space to look at our assumptions, to look at our intuitions, to do those kinds of things. And yet, you've also really highlighted how powerful those master narratives are in terms of forming the backdrop. Depending on where we might each locate ourselves, we may be more or less able to recognize when those master narratives are at play or the ways in which they come together. And I think in particular, that then got me thinking more about what you said about power, right? And how power is part of this. And I think in the Canadian bioethics context, whether it's through the Canadian Bioethics Society or through the Canadian Association of Practicing Healthcare Ethicists, whether you're more academic oriented or more practice oriented in terms of doing bioethics work, there has been that conversation around who are we when we're doing bioethics work? And I think there's also then connecting to the narrative piece. What are the stories that we tell ourselves about what we think we're doing? And what are the stories that others are trying to fit us into, right? So sometimes I would say, I think as a bioethicist, you're kind of actively resisting. People want you to put you in a certain storyline and you're going, but that's not what we do. We want to be something different. But also as a field, by the very nature of what bioethics for many folks is about in terms of asking hard questions, engaging with our moral intuitions, engaging with our values, and looking at those aspects, also recognizing sometimes as the ethics person, you have more power to raise those questions and maybe can help create that space for activists to be part of, right? Or for those counter narratives to become part of the conversation. But also in other situations, recognizing power also shapes what we're able to do or not do sometimes, or what we're able to say or not say. And whether it's from a peer review process or whether it's in meetings in hospitals, for example, I think then it causes me to think a little bit more too then about what are the master narratives around activism in and of itself too? Like what's the picture that people have in their minds? And I love that the picture that you've used of the wheelchair, folks in their wheelchairs, blocking a road, right? That's different. It's a different picture. It's a powerful picture in another kind of way. And so it is that part around, as we think about the master narratives and counter narratives for both bioethics and activism, it is that piece. And we've been, I think, moving back and forth in different ways in Canada around what's the power piece of it. If you're doing bioethics, are you obligated to look at and change the narratives, right? And if I use those words for it, I think people would use other mechanisms for it. But really thinking about how that all comes together. So in so many ways, and that's my way of saying to Joe, thank you for your comments and your paper. because by flipping the question in the way that you did, it not only got me to think more about disability bioethics in particular, but also about, you know, that broader question for me: what are we doing when we're doing bioethics? And does doing bioethics mean we're activists? Does it mean that we're creating space and common ground or openings for that? Or what is our relationship with activists, as you would say, activists who don't identify as bioethicists, right? And then those ways too. So many different strands that we could take this, and I say thank you very much again for that. So all of that being said, I do see that there's questions in our question and answer box. And I'm just going to sort of, as I pull different ones up, Joe, I'll invite you to share your thoughts around this. So I think an interesting one that sort of kicks off really the focus on disability bioethics is sort of in terms of your arguments and how you put the discussion on this topic together. Do you need a clear understanding of disability in and of itself to engage in this discussion?
As far as a clear theory of disability, of what disability is, I don't think so, actually. I think that, you know, a lot of ink has been spilled trying to work through, you know, a precise model of disability, the medical model versus the social model versus, you know, the minority model, and so on and so forth. I mean, anybody who's interested in that topic, I think, you know, one of the best overviews of it is the first chapter in Elizabeth Barnes's book, The Minority Body, where she sort of looks at the entire landscape of theories of disability before developing what she calls her own, I think she calls it the moderate constructivist view. I don't think that for my argument, you necessarily need to have a specific view of, you know, the ontology of disability, you know, what disability is in a strict sense. And the reason why I don't think that you need a specific view of that is that we're talking about narrative identity, right? And narrative identity is never that precise, right? You know, these are stories that are socially constructed, and that's sort of weave together all sorts of different features of a life, right? And group features, right? And so, you know, when you talk about something like the master narrative of the pitiful disabled people, that is sort of a stereotype in and of itself. And so to think about that and to try to challenge that, you don't necessarily need you know, a theory that says, well, you know, this applies to I don't know, the master narrative of the pitiful disabled person better off dead applies to somebody with ALS, but it doesn't apply to somebody that's colorblind, or, you know, it applies to somebody with a spinal cord injury, but you know, it doesn't apply to somebody that identifies as big D deaf and doesn't, you know, because these questions of who counts as disabled just doesn't matter to master narratives, right? Yeah. You know, you know, master narratives work at the level of gross overgeneralizations, and so, you know, when you challenge master narratives, I think it would be almost silly to sort of get bogged down in questions around, you know, what counts as disability or not. Now, some of these theoretical discussions can be important, sort of when you're making arguments sort of at the level of you know, the rationality and the reasoning, right? Once you find sort of this common habitus, and can sort of come together with intuitions that line up a little bit better as far as what kinds of arguments one finds intuitively appealing, then you can have discussions around, what counts as disability or not, right?
Yeah.
But you can't even get to that point without doing some of this narrative work. I think, one good example perhaps would be the Terry Schiavo case in the United States. Now, this was, going on when I was a baby bioethicist, when I was in graduate school. And, we had this controversy over this woman that was in a vegetative state from sort of a brain injury. And there was controversy over whether to view this situation as, removing invasive, highly artificial, extraordinary life support means from someone who, wasn't even really alive, right? Versus, various folks in the disability community who themselves use feeding tubes, right? And I want to say, well, that's not invasive, and that's not, an extraordinary life support means. That's just how we eat, right? And so you're killing a disabled person here just because of how they eat, right? So there wasn't that kind of common ground as far as who disabled people are and what you can expect from them that was sort of shared across these two standpoints of mainstream bioethics and disability activists. And so conversations around whether or not Terry Schiavo ought to be considered a disabled person or not, right? Were kind of useless, right? Because how you had folks saying that using a feeding tube was some kind of horrible, tragic thing, which disability activists were just sort of going to reject right out of the gate. Right. Does that make sense in answer to the question?
Yes, yeah, no, it definitely does. And as I've been scanning some of the other questions, you're hitting on some aspects that people were wanting to follow up with you about too. So I think just in terms of where you were ending, right, and sort of coming back to that common ground piece again, I have a question about that, and then I'll go to a question that's more about the activism side again, right? So if I can move back and forth. So one is, the question about common ground is, if activism can or must help create that common ground between different habiti, does this imply that not only the powerful, right, or the master narratives, but the oppressed must also be ready to compromise to reach a common ground or a middle ground? And if so, is this really fair and just for those that are oppressed?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily implies that common ground is middle ground. I think that these are two different concepts, right? If we were to find a middle ground, then that would imply that folks in the Black Lives Matter movement had to allow for some white supremacy or something, right? Which would be ridiculous. And so I think common ground can be just sort of taking the oppressive features of a master narrative and really rooting them out, and destroying them and getting rid of them forever and always, and burning them to the ground and replacing them with a counter story that then provides the common ground. But not necessarily the middle ground, right? And so that's, kind of how I was arguing against the idea that there is sort of this neutral, objective point of view, right? That's a myth anyway, right? And so to say that we have to, try to find that neutral, objective point of view by meeting in the middle, I think can be just as damaging as claiming that those with the power already have founded the neutral, objective middle ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think I really appreciated that question because it allows that distinction that I thought you were wanting to make in your work as well. And in that, you've already hinted at this, but another question was, does all activism necessarily disrupt master narratives? And if not, are there constraints or criteria for activism that advances bioethical theory?
Ooh, that's
Yeah.
a good one.
Yeah.
Does all activism necessarily disrupt master narratives? Well, I think that raises the question of, what do we consider to be activism? My gut reaction is to say, well, all activism that's worthy of the name activism disrupts master narratives, right? And if it's not disrupting a master narrative, it's something other than sort of real activism, right? Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I will adopt that position, right? Maybe I will say that sort of in order to be rightly considered activist work, it has to be challenging power dynamics in some way, right? It has to be attuned to power disparities and trying to balance out folks with disparate social power positions, right? In order to actually be activism and not something else, right? There was this disability activist, he was in the US named Andy Imperato, who I've become, fairly friendly with over the years. And he gave a speech once at a conference that I was at, and he talked about how the disability movement needs to move away from what he was calling sophisticated begging. And so sophisticated begging, he was referring to as, putting together your little PowerPoint slide and showing up at the congressman's office to give all of your your reasons and so forth for why we ought to have better choices for long-term care and not as much institutionalization, and why we need stronger civil rights protection and employment law and so on and so forth. And he sort of referred to that as sophisticated begging because there was no challenge to the power dynamic in those kinds of quasi activism, right? He said what we need is to figure out ways to leverage the power of the disability community, maybe through voting, right? Maybe through being seen as a constituency with real voting power that's politicians need to pay attention to and be accountable toward, right? Or maybe through other means of activism that balance out sort of disparate power dynamics. And so I want to say that, yes, that all activism that is worthy of the name does, in some sense, challenge power dynamics. And so I think anytime you're challenging power dynamics in some way, you are, in fact, challenging master narratives that tell a story that folks that are marginalized don't and ought not to have power.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense, as we're working this through together and seeing where your thoughts go. And with that then, right, and sort of I think coming back to one of the questions is about sort of the bioethicist role in some of those spaces. And the question is sort of in relation to disability activism, one wonders if the bioethicists might come under attack from both the sort of the system, I think the master narratives, and those that are disabled in certain circumstances where individual needs do not align with the standard discourse or ideology, right? Because you're kind of caught between both perspectives, if you will, right, or both narratives. How would you respond to that, or how would you think about that aspect?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real challenge, right? Because the bioethicist, I mean, it depends on what you're calling bioethics here, right? If you're talking about bioethics scholarship, I think the answer is easier, right? And when you're talking about publishing a paper or giving a talk or something, then you can establish your premises first, right? And establish that, common ground and take up the counter stories before you go into your argument, right? And so, you might write a paper on the Terry Schiavo case and sort of say, okay, I accept that these aren't, extraordinary means and that this is just eating, right? To, have a feeding tube. But nevertheless, let's, talk about some of these other concerns in analyzing that case, right? I think that it might be trickier when doing clinical bioethics consultation, right? Because of the fact that well, nobody really cares if you want to, establish your moral premises when you're doing a moral consult, right? What you're trying to do is find a solution to a problem that doesn't hurt someone, or that at least minimizes the harm done in a given situation. And so, just to try to I don't know, to try to imagine, yourself in a situation like the Schiavo case. Maybe there is hope to sort of saying, okay, well, if I set aside these ableist master narratives around, what disability is and what it means and who disabled people are and so on and so forth, and then try to find a solution to this case, maybe it turns out that, I am more sympathetic to the situation of the parents of Terry Schiavo, and, and sort of see her as a person in her own right that, they want to continue to have a relationship with, in some sense, regardless of what Andrew Schiavo wanted, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the laws as we have them here, determine that Andrew, has, the right to determine, what happens, and, has the legal authority to remove life-saving care. And so I need to explain that to the parents, and sort of explain that this is sort of the power dynamic that we are in right now, for better or worse. And so, that might be the way to go about it. And sort of at least recognizing the fact that you are sort of caught between these two narratives, and maybe giving ground to the counter narrative, the counter story, but nevertheless sort of recognizing the power dynamic for what it is and how it constrains you in the solutions that you can come up with.
Great, thanks. Yeah, because another person had been asking about sort of activism when you're within the institution, right, as an employee, and when you're external or arm's length. And I think what you were just saying there has really actually kind of connected some of that together, that there are constraints depending on where you're situated in some ways, which isn't the same as saying, oh, well, I can't do anything about it, right? Or I can't engage or create that space or make those efforts, right? Okay, being mindful of those power dynamics. Okay, no, that's really good. And I just wanted to share too, Joe, that during your talk, one of the audience members was asking a question about activism from a disability perspective and activism from a number of other perspectives. So thinking race, class, gender, and those things. And then on your subsequent slide, you had addressed that and sort of saying, well, it could be any one of these perspectives and the intersections between them that can address that too. So very much appreciating that you were anticipating that type of question and making that helpful. We also have a question that then gets at a little bit more the activism piece. If you're thinking from a physical disability perspective and an invisible disability perspective, and knowing you talk in your paper about sort of different situations that people might be in, is it helpful if advocacy for within disability is focused on different groups or different aspects of it? And if not, is it better that it should be thinking about activism in general for disabled people? Does that make sense, right? Sort of whether you want to break it down into physical disability and visible disability, or whether it's better to.
So, I mean, I think that the way I approach this question in the paper is that there might be different risks posed to different disabled people when it comes to doing activism. And I think that's the interesting question here, right? Because if you take someone like me, right? I'm white, I'm cishet, I have a middle-class background, I have a very visible disability, and so on and so forth. If I engage in something like nonviolent direct action, it's going to pose much less risk to me than someone who is poor, who is queer, who is Black, who is maybe has an invisible disability, and so on and so forth, right? And so I think when thinking about different kinds of disabled people and different kinds of disabilities and the intersectionality question, there is this problem of who gets to be activists, right? Who finds this kind of activist work accessible, okay? And so in answer to that question, I want to say two things. One is I used nonviolent direct action as sort of the hard test case for my argument, right? Meaning that I wanted to look at whether or not disability activists had something to contribute to bioethics writ large when they were being activists the most, right? When they were being the least rational, so to speak, right? When they're, out there, in the street, causing a ruckus and so on and so forth, right? That doesn't mean that there aren't other forms of activism that can do this work of changing master narratives, right? Other important, legitimate modes of activism, right? So Alice Wong, right, has this new book out. I would argue that writing this kind of book in the way that she did is a kind of activism, right? So someone, who had an invisible disability, who has a blog, right? And there's, someone like my friend Cal Montgomery, right? Has a great disability blog. Or Autistic Hoya, who is Lydia Brown, has another really widely read, famous blog. They're activists, right? And so different modes of activism are going to be available to different people, okay? But that doesn't mean that one mode of activism that is not accessible to everyone is wrong or is bad, right? Someone with an intellectual disability might not be able to have a blog or write a memoir, and might do better out in the street with a picket sign, right? And so I think my point here is that it's good and it's important to look at and to consider different disabilities and different modes of activism that are going to be available to different people, while being happy with the idea that there is not one way to do activism and that we need all of it. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it gets at it, Joe, for sure. And I think I recognize there's some more questions coming in, and so people are definitely engaged with what you're arguing for and talking about here, Joe. But I also recognize we have just a few minutes left in our time together. So we'll certainly share the other questions that we haven't been able to get to with Joe. So he'll see those questions, and I apologize for folks that were not able to get to all of them during this time. Because I did want to say a huge thank you to Joe for both his presentation, the paper itself, and all the thinking that went into it, and then just fabulous to have some time to to chat with you and engage with our colleagues through this mechanism in terms of a CBS conversation. So thank you for giving us so many different things to think about in terms of activism and what that means for bioethics as a field. So very much appreciated. Yeah. And with that, I'll also say thank you to everyone who participated and came today. That's quite wonderful to see you. Big pitch for the next CBS conversation as well. And I will hand it back to Catherine Duthie from CBS just to close things off with us today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christy. And I echo all the thanks, especially to you, Joe, for coming and sharing your thoughts. So much to think about. I learned that I can't actually type anything into the Q&A as a panelist. So I just had to sit on my hands and think of all these things I wish I could ask you. Anyway, well, maybe there'll be a future opportunity. So thanks to everyone for joining. As a reminder, please do consider filling out the survey. Let us know what you think of this session, ideas for future topics and so forth. And we really do look forward to seeing you again in November for our November session on bioethics and racism. And otherwise, I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, to the organizers and the audience. Appreciate you.